Dr. John B. Cobb Jr. is Ingram Professor of Theology and Director of the Center for Process Studies at the School of Theology at Claremont, California. He is a leading theologian and has written extensively in his field. In this series, Dr. Cobb lectures on process theology and discusses various points of these lectures with Dr. Mary Ellen Kilsby, pastor of the Altadena Congregational Church.
Hello, I'm Mary Ellen Kilsby, pastor of the Altadena Congregational Church, a United Church of Christ, and I'm here with John B. Cobb Jr., professor at the School of Theology at Claremont and Systematic Theology, and the leading spokesman for what has become known as process theology. We're now going to be presenting the fifth tape in a series entitled Faith and a Relational Vision. And this tape will be Incarnation and the Relational Vision. Many of you will be watching this as the fifth tape, although some may have decided to start here and deal with Christology at the beginning. But we hope that you'll watch all of the tapes, which will eventually be 8. And without any further ado, I think we'll get into John's lecture to his own church's adult class on Incarnation and a Relational Vision.
The first session, we talked about the relational universe in general terms. That is a way of thinking about the world which has begun to become prominent in the past century, but is still struggling against an atomistic or substantialist way of thinking of things as fundamentally separate from each other and unrelated to each other. And then last time we talked about how this affected the way we understood the human self. We understand ourselves as members one of another instead of as discrete beings separate from and over against one another. And we also understand God as not being a perfect example of one who is completely self-contained, but rather a perfect example of relationships with all other things. So we participate in God, and God participates in us. Now, today we want to talk about how all this affects our understanding of Christ and the church. Last time I read with you a few verses from the prologue to John's Gospel as a way of saying something about how in the New Testament God is understood in relationship to the world, and we put the emphasis on the fact that the Word is that apart from which nothing was made. This Word is God, and this Word is the life and the light of all things. Now, it is this same prologue that did more than anything else to shape the Christology of the church. And so I wanted to read a few more verses, not to say that a process Christology is going to be identical with what we find in the prologue. I'm sure that the conceptualities involved are certainly not identical, and yet it seems to me to be remarkably appropriate to what is said here. So I will begin with verse 9 this time and just come to that verse, which is the incarnational verse in the whole of the New Testament par excellence. The true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and yet the world knew him not. He came to his own home, and his own people received him not. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of God, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. I knew that couldn't make sense the way I read it the first time. And then the next verse is the one that says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay. Now, this notion of incarnation, I think you will see from what I've been saying the last 2 times, is a very congenial notion for process thought. Incarnation means that something is really and truly constitutively present in something else. It really takes on body within some other reality. So that when process theologians approach the doctrine of the incarnation, we do so with enthusiasm, not with some sense of how difficult it's going to be to make some kind of sense of this idea that God was really and truly present in Jesus. What I want to point out, though, is that it is the light that enlightens everyone that comes into the world in Jesus. The doctrine of incarnation, which in general I and many process theologians feel enthusiastic about, is one which has given a great deal of trouble conceptually and religiously in the history of the church. And today, of course, it still is a bone of contention. It's a source of much hostility to Christianity, both within and without the church. Jews, of course, are offended by the doctrine of the Incarnation. Muslims are offended by the doctrine of the Incarnation. But also among Christians, there are those who say, this is nonsense. It's quite impossible for God to become a human being. That way of thinking is simply, essentially mythological. And I do want to agree that it is often formulated in ways which do seem to me to be mythological. So I want to talk about that a little bit and try to make as clear as I can that there is a way of thinking of the Incarnation, which I think is quite appropriate to this classical passage, which doesn't partake of that mythological and distorting character, which I think others and many Christians rightly find offensive. There was a book published in Great Britain not long ago called The Myth of God Incarnate, and it really was calling on Christians to get rid of this false notion that has played too central a role in the history of Christianity. And as I say, I don't like that. I don't want to get rid of the notion of God incarnate. I simply want to understand it in a way that is not mythological. Okay. If you think of myths of gods incarnate, you can think of Zeus taking the form of a bull. That's clearly, from our point of view, a mythological notion. So Zeus is transmuted into being a bull. When Zeus becomes a bull, Zeus is no longer on Mount Olympus. Zeus is wherever the bull is, and at least according to the stories, the bull didn't stay on Mount Olympus, but was doing other things at other places. So there are mythological notions of gods becoming something other than gods. They could also take the form of a human being, of course. But that is not, I think, what the Christian doctrine of incarnation is all about. Indeed, there was a tremendous struggle in the early church over a very influential view of incarnation, which could be understood something like Zeus taking on the form of a human being or of a bull or something of that sort. And that was the view put forth by a man by the name of Arius. And Arius gives his name to what is now called a heresy. We call it Arianism. But it was 100 years before it became settled that that was heresy rather than orthodoxy. And there were times when Arianism was the dominant structure of belief. It had control of the imperial court in Constantinople, and so forth. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Arians were just as good people as the other party, but nevertheless, I'm very glad myself that in the end, the church rejected Arianism, because the Arian view was the view that before God created anything else, God created a super angelic being who was designated to be the Savior of the world. And this super angelic being remained with God, and indeed God used this supreme creature as an instrument of creating all things. Arius was trying to do justice to the passage that we are focusing on, that the Word was with God and the Word was God. He would not admit that the Word was God. The Word was a creature and not God. Now, if you think in those terms, that there is a supreme creature who was with God in heaven from before the foundation of the world, it is possible to think of such a being as taking on human form and becoming Jesus of Nazareth. Well, that was Arius' view. But of course, when that supreme being when that supreme creature took on the form of Jesus, the body of Jesus, that supreme creature was no longer in heaven. You see, that this is the actual movement of a being from heaven to earth, ceasing to be in heaven and coming to be on earth. So it's more analogous to Zeus taking on some kind of human or animal form. Well, there's so many verses, so many passages in the New Testament that can be read in such a way as to fit that kind of understanding that it was not easy to decide against Arianism. But the church did decide against Arianism, and that on two counts. One count was that if you are an Arian, you do not believe that the divine reality that you encounter in Jesus is truly God. And secondly, if you're an Arian, you do not believe that Jesus is truly human. Jesus is a metamorphosed form of a super-angelic creature, and that is neither God nor human. And the church struggled and struggled with that and came to the final answer: Jesus is truly God and truly human. Now, some people, unfortunately, have kept that kind of notion of a metamorphosis and tried to apply it when they thought of one who was both God and human. And that leads to very strange ways of thinking. If you took it with strict literalness, it would sound as if during the period when Jesus was on earth, God was nowhere else except in Jesus. Now, no theologian has ever said that. But I'm simply trying to suggest the image. If you take the image of incarnation from these other accounts and then say that's what it means to say that the Word became flesh, you end up with really nonsensical and, from my point of view, blasphemous ideas about the nature of the relationship between God and the world, or God and Jesus. So I think we simply need to exclude that kind of thinking. And if we could do so clearly, once for all, much of the hostility that is generated toward Christianity in other traditions could be reduced, if not eliminated. So I think much is to be gained, and I see nothing that is to be lost by saying that is clearly not what is said in this passage or anywhere else in the Bible so far as I can discover.
John, before we go on, I think I'd like to review just a little bit. What you have just done for us is to lay out those attitudes about Jesus, or those definitions of Jesus even, that you feel have not worked for the Christian, and then indeed as we've conversed with other religions in the world. Would you review for us again, just very quickly, what those attitudes toward Jesus have been that you do not feel are helpful?
Well, there are a lot of people who, even if they don't believe it, seem to think that just the simple statement, Jesus is God, is orthodoxy. And when you ask, what in the world does that mean? It sounds as though it means that God somehow ceased to be God and just became Jesus, or Jesus, as that creaturely being on earth, embodied the totality of God, and that was all there was of God. It's a very strange kind of notion. Few people would want to defend it if you press them. Mm-hmm. And yet you hear so many people who feel somehow as Christians they're supposed to believe something like that.
Yes.
And so many people who are not Christians say, I couldn't believe that, and therefore reject Christianity. So I realize I'm spending a lot of time on the negative, but I do think we have to uproot that kind of thinking, or we will forever make Christianity a very strange kind of doctrine indeed.
In growing up, I think I felt that somehow got the idea that God was still God out there, I think we felt, and that yet Jesus was somehow constituted more of whatever that was as God than any of the rest of us. Are you trying to get away from that notion as well?
Well, I think that idea is less damaging, and therefore I don't want to reject it in a total way, but in the next part of the tape I will be trying to put it in a little different way. I think the relational vision enables us to express what was implied by the Johannine prologue and by the kinds of things that the creeds say. They're struggling against their own language in very painful ways.
Yes, of course.
That in a more convincing way than just speaking of somehow more and less. I don't think the language of more and less is quite adequate.
Well, I think we're in a position right now then when we can go on with the rest of the lecture and see what it is you do feel is helpful in thinking about Jesus.
that God ceased to be God in order to be Jesus. It just doesn't make sense, and it's an unfortunate misunderstanding of the notion of incarnation. Okay, so let's assume that is not what's intended. Then what is intended? Well, the gospel here says the true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. Well, of course, paradoxically, the true light that enlightens every man was already in some way in the world, wasn't it? Otherwise, it couldn't be enlightening anyone. But nevertheless, there is a strong sense that in Jesus, this word that is already present, enlightening everyone, and if we go back earlier, giving life to all that is alive, that word takes on a full embodiment in Jesus. Now, we find also that what happens for those who receive is that they become children of God. And of course, one of the most common terms used with respect to Jesus is Son of God. So some people want to emphasize that we become children of God as Jesus was Son of God. I want to emphasize that the way God was present in Jesus is not fundamentally different from the way in which God is present in the believer. Some would say this is a matter of degree, that there is a perfection of the way in which God was present in Jesus, which is lacking in others, so that we look to Jesus as the revelation of what it most fully means for God to be constitutively present. And I think there's a lot in the New Testament that moves along those lines. You'll probably gather that I don't think every sentiment expressed in the New Testament is completely consistent with every other sentiment expressed in the New Testament. And that's the reason we've had such chaos in the history of Christian thought. Different people are struck by different passages and take their cue for the interpretation of everything else from various loci within the New Testament. And that's fine. I don't want that kind of chaos ever to disappear. But in any case, this note that we become brothers and sisters of Jesus as we become children of God, since Jesus is the Son of God, is one thoroughly legitimate way of understanding what it means that the light that is in everyone takes on bodily form in Jesus. The Church, however, has wanted to generally emphasize that there is a distinction between the way in which the Word is present in Jesus, this incarnation, and the incarnation of God in the world in general. I personally think we should think of God as incarnate in everything, not only in Jesus. But it's still quite legitimate to ask, but what's so distinctive then about Jesus? And what is distinctive about the way in which God was present in Jesus? And I can share with you my own way of thinking about that, which has no status other than a personal opinion. If you will accept it as such, I will be happy to try to suggest it. I think it fits roughly with the creedal formulations, but certainly is not exactly what those who formulated the creeds had in mind. So I don't want to try to pretend that I am exegeting Chalcedon, and yet I do feel some inspiration from Chalcedon as I try to work this kind of thing out for myself. Well, in my own experience of the presence of God in my life, and I do want to emphasize that, I do not believe I have any life apart from the presence of God in my life, I experience God in some way as an other who is present. I experience God as gracious. I experience God as judging. I experience God as calling, as demanding, as strengthening. But all of those suggest that there is one, namely myself, who is being challenged or strengthened or judged or graced by the presence of God. So there is an element of what we have often called an I-thou relationship. The thou is present in my experience. The thou is not some remote absence, something other in that radical sense of other, but it is present in my experience as another is present in my experience. Now, it seems to me that that is not the only possible way in which God can be present. God can be present, could be present, also as constitutive of the very self. You see, since we are thinking now not of permanent human substances, but rather of human experiences. What we are analyzing is different types of experience, different possible structures of experience. And within any experience, there is some kind of an organizing center of that experience. I call that the self or the I. And the question is, how is that I constituted in any given moment? Well, I think that the I, as it ordinarily functions in my experience, is constituted by a relationship to my own past experiences. And then anything that comes to me not from my own past experiences, but from outside my own past experiences, has the feel of being something other than myself. So this tension or this distinction between the self and the other is retained. But in principle, there's no reason that a human experience could not center in the relationship to God or the mode of the divine presence. I can't testify to such experience. I'm simply saying it's not an inconceivable notion that God might be incarnate not simply as another within experience, but as the very center, the very self of that experience. And as I read the New Testament, it seems to me that Jesus did not experience, often at least, God as an other in the way in which I do, but rather that God's presence in Jesus' life provided the very center or perspective in terms of which Jesus saw the rest of the world. I find that in the creeds it speaks of the fact that Jesus is jointly constituted by the human and the divine. And I think we can understand that the very self of Jesus is jointly constituted by the way Jesus was related to his own past and by the presence of God within him. So that's my translation out of a substantialist way of thinking, which certainly dominated those who were working with Chalcedon, into an event mode of thinking, of something of the desire to do justice to both the human and the divinity within Jesus. But there are lots of changes that follow if one thinks this way, rather than in the substantialist modes of thought that dominated Chalcedon. For one thing, this incarnation, in this full and strictest sense, is a matter that reoccurs moment by moment. So that when we come to the famous cry of Jesus from the cross, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" we can take that seriously. That is, I think there were times in Jesus' life when that not just sense of unity, but the reality of unity with God was broken. It seems to me that in various ways the New Testament testifies to that. Jesus was really tempted, we are told. Well, it seems to me that that implies that this unity with God was not simply a kind of metaphysical or physical givenness for Jesus, but rather something that characterized his life and his experience by virtue of it being renewed moment by moment, and that there were times when that kind of relationship could be broken. So I'm trying to recognize that what I'm suggesting as a way of thinking of the full and radical incarnation of God in Jesus, in its distinctiveness from the way in which I find God incarnate in the world in general and even in Christian believers, does not entail some of the notions and ideas which have been formulated in Christian orthodoxy, and I don't want to try to conceal my heresies, if that's what they are, in my effort to indicate there is some continuity, at least, with the historic teaching of the Church on this point.
John, that was very helpful for me. I felt like I could relate to what you were saying about Jesus and the Incarnation. I did realize in listening to that tape that it was helpful for me to have heard your first tapes when you talked about the difference between the relational vision and the substantive vision. And I just want to suggest to the audience and the groups that are watching these tapes that that would be helpful now to go back and to hear those tapes. You did mention Chalcedon, or the Chalcedon Creed, and you might want to talk a little bit more about out of which the milieu out of which that came,
yes,
as opposed to where we're struggling with Jesus today. The other thing that you mentioned was, we've talked a lot about John, and yet John also talks about God sending his only Son.
yes,
And how you would relate that?
Yes, well, that emphasis that it is God's only Son, and many other New Testament emphases which really single out this event as something radically different, are the reason I'm not quite satisfied with what a good many theologians do in simply emphasizing that Jesus is our elder brother. That's also very good New Testament teaching, but it seems more needs to be said before we've done justice to the many emphases. The struggle in the early church centered around two great centers of Christian teaching, Antioch and Alexandria. And the Alexandrians were deeply concerned to say that the very center of Jesus' existence is God. And therefore, when they formulated what was going on in the Incarnation, the humanity of Jesus seemed almost always to get short shrift.
Very unimportant.
It didn't really matter, that's right. And then at Antioch, where they paid a lot more attention to the Synoptic Gospels, for example, they had a very strong commitment to the idea that Jesus was really and truly a human being. And of course, God dwelt in Jesus, and there was very strong language they wanted to use, but Jesus was a human being in whom God dwelt. Now, the creedal controversies came out of that kind of a tension in the early church. And Chalcedon was a verbal resolution of that, which insisted both sides were right, as long as both sides took the other side fully seriously. And obviously the signers of Chalcedon didn't all have the same idea in mind when they signed it. It's like a committee document always, that you work for a language which will satisfy both sides, and they can go home and interpret it their own way.
Like we do today.
Like we do today.
And we forget often, I think, as we read those old creeds, that they came out of those kinds of tensions, and we somehow think that they were like a pronouncement on high, and indeed they came out of very human struggles.
They did indeed, and those struggles are still going on in the church. And I'm no doubt more on the side of Antioch than on the side of Alexandria. I think it's important to be on that side because, ironically, I think ironically, the Chalcedonian Creed has generally been interpreted as if it were an Alexandrian victory. And I think historically it was not. It was an Antiochene check upon Alexandria. And even further councils of the church were held. And surprisingly, church kept insisting, for example, that there was a fully human will in Jesus, against the view that, well, maybe there were two of this and two of this, but when it comes to the will, only one.
And so that Jesus' cry from the cross, which you mentioned, and his temptations were real temptations. These were not play acting as if God was trying to show us what might be, or some stories written about those. These are real temptations of a real human being.
Indeed, and that's, the New Testament really insists on that, and any effort to turn Jesus into a God who just walks around in human form is a heresy, and everyone agrees on that, and yet that keeps coming back into the church.
Will you be dealing next time with how then we relate to Jesus in this dimension, or do you want to say something more about that now?
Well, I think that we'd better discuss that in the midst of the next tape as we go ahead.
Very good. And so we hope you'll join us at the next tape, which will continue this discussion and deal with Christ and the relational vision. Hello, I'm Mary Ellen Kilsby, and I'm sitting here with John B. Cobb Jr. at the School of Theology in Claremont, and we, along with you, are watching a series of tapes entitled Faith and a Relational Vision. This is tape 6, and it is entitled Christ and the Church. It follows very closely the last tape, 5, which dealt with the Incarnation. And right now, we're going to be dealing more specifically with Jesus and the term Christ, and how this all relates to us in the church in the 1980s.
Now, incarnation is one of the central Christological doctrines, but the word Christ is a Greek translation of the Jewish word Messiah. And I think we need to say a little bit about what does that word mean when we use it. I think that in the history of Christianity, it has had two rather distinct uses which have led to a lot of confusion. One of those uses is simply as the translation of the Hebrew idea of the Messiah. Now, the Hebrew Messiah is a label or term given to one who performs a particular role in human history. And that role would be, as the Jew today also thinks of it, that role would be to bring about shalom. We might say to bring about the kingdom of God. So that to say that Jesus was the Messiah in Jewish ears sounds very strange, because 1900 years later, they do not observe that the world lives at peace, and they do not observe that justice reigns everywhere. So that from that point of view, history has disproved any claim that Jesus was the Messiah. That is, Jesus did not fulfill the expectations of the Messiah in the way in which those expectations were formulated by Jews. And they are absolutely correct, therefore, in saying, if you mean by Messiah what we mean by Messiah, Jesus was not the Messiah. Okay, that's just true. Now, of course, Christians, in a sense, have always known that was true. And so we have said, no, of course, that you are right. Jesus did not fulfill the expectations, the central expectations that clustered around the idea of Messiah. But what Jesus did do was to bring at a deeper level the kind of the salvation that the Messiah was to bring. Only it was so different from what was expected that we claim that the label Messiah is appropriate in a transformed way. Now, that's the old argument from the early church down to the present. There was great struggles to show how many of the Old Testament prophecies Jesus actually had fulfilled. In many cases, I think modern biblical scholars would side with the Jews against the early Christians in the exegesis of many of those passages. But in any case, this argument was extremely important. But very rapidly, as Christianity became a predominantly Gentile religion, the meanings of Messiah that were caught up in the word Christ became secondary to other meanings. And we need to recognize that when today we speak of Christ, we are not using the word in the same way that contemporary Jews use the word Messiah. The debate need not go on in quite the way in which it then went on. We can agree with Jews, and of course the early Christians agreed, that many of the prophecies had not yet been fulfilled. So they looked forward to something that was to happen in the future. And the prayer we most frequently pray is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Not as if already with the coming of Jesus, God's kingdom had come and God's will was now being done on earth, but that we anticipate, we hope for, just as Jews do, the coming of shalom. See, so there's very much that we share with Jews. But Jesus is so important for us and for our salvation and our whole understanding of the nature of reality that we hold on to that title Christ. Only now we transform it really into a cosmic notion instead of simply the label given to one who performs a particular function in history. So when, for example, the World Council of Churches decides to say, Jesus Christ, the life of the world, I trust it doesn't mean that the historical figure of Jesus is the biological life of every plant. That to me would make no sense whatsoever. But to say that Christ is the life of the world is another way of making the point that we've made here. See, Christ is God. Christ is the Word, and that the Word is the form of God. Christ is the Word as the Word is present in the world, in all things. The redemptive, creative activity of God everywhere we discern as Christ. And it is this universal principle of life and light, creation and redemption, which is the presence of God in all things, which we call Christ. Now, then, of course, we have again the problem of how do we associate this Christ so closely with this historical figure, Jesus? And I think some of the things that I said before about incarnation are a way of seeing why it is that Jesus for us is the Christ. even though it has been possible for many Christians, such as Luther, to tell us we should be Christ to our neighbor. The notion of Christ is not absolutely limited to this one figure, Jesus, but it receives its meaning from this figure, Jesus. It is through Jesus that we Gentiles especially, have any access to an understanding of the fact that the universe is under God as creative, redemptive power working everywhere and at all times. So for us, Christ is bound up with Jesus, and I think it is not only a subjective judgment on our part, but a statement about the nature of reality when we claim that it is in Jesus that Christ is made known and is present and is real, so that to say, in this sense also, Jesus is the Christ, can make a lot of sense.
John, you talked about two very different definitions of Christ. And it seems to me we even talk about the Christ figure in art, for example. Would you just very briefly summarize those two definitions of the Christ, and then perhaps how that has fit when we talk about the Christ figure in the arts, and how then those relate to Jesus, the person of Jesus?
Well, the first meaning is simply that Christos, was the Greek translation of Messiah. Mm-hmm. And we have to then try to get back into the meaning of the idea of Messiah at the time that translation was made. And the early Christians were claiming Jesus is the Messiah. And my point there is that in that argument between those who said Jesus was the Messiah and those who said Jesus wasn't the Messiah, a lot went on in trying to understand what Messiah was. And certainly by the full meaning of what the Jews meant by Messiah, Jesus was not the Messiah. We can only say that Jesus was the Messiah if we say, but he's going to come again and do this, that, and the other thing to fulfill those expectations. That gets increasingly awkward as the millennia pass after the time of Jesus.
Yes, I understand that. Let me interrupt you a minute, but because I remember in Sunday school, the way we got around that issue was to say that, yes, Jesus was the Messiah. It's just that the Jews were looking for the wrong kind of Messiah.
Yes, and I think that in the arguments between Christians and Jews today, we have to agree that Christians haven't played quite fair on all of that.
Okay. I would agree with that.
Yes, and that we need to listen to what the Jews have to say on that again. Of course, some of the Jews did think that the Messiah would be a military figure, and in that sense one can say that the reasons for not accepting Jesus might have been mistaken. But that's not the primary thing. The most important point is simply that when the Messiah comes, the Messianic age will be here.
The day of Shalom.
It's extremely difficult for Jews, or for me, or for Christians, I think, today, to think that Shalom has arrived and that the world is now in a state of Shalom.
Then the second sense of the Christ was as you call it, the cosmic sense of the Christ. Say a little bit more about it.
Well, whatever may be the case about those early debates, nevertheless, it was through those events and through the cross and resurrection of Jesus that an understanding of God, which prior to that had been limited pretty much to the Jewish community, became available to the Gentiles. And so there are today in the world hundreds of millions of people who have been engrafted into the Jewish understanding of God and life with God because of Jesus. And Jesus' importance is therefore for us as Gentile Christians simply immense. And associated with that enormous importance and the profound sense that our salvation has been effected through this figure, there has been an expansion of the notion of Christ to the way in which God works creatively and redemptively in the world.
So in artistic sense, the Christ figure is any artistic figure that then deepens our understanding of that kind of salvation or understanding of God or how those events work in the world. Is that fair?
Yes, and of course especially shaped by the extraordinary and surprising fact that Jesus died on a cross. Yes. So when we speak of the Christ figure, we almost always associate it with one who whose suffering is redemptive for others. So it's not a notion of God's redemptive work in the world that would have arisen independently of Jesus. It's the way that understanding of God's redemptive work was shaped by the real facts about Jesus.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. And now let's go back to the lecture, and I think we'll deal with how then that is present in with us today, and especially in the church.
Yes. Now, that suggests that when we speak today of the presence of Jesus Christ, we might simply be speaking of the presence of God present in the world creatively, redemptively. But I think that is not all that the rhetoric of the church has meant by the presence of Jesus Christ in the world. There is a sense in which Jesus is present with us, which is not simply another way of talking about the way in which the everlasting power of God as Christ is present with us. And the most important expression of this seems to me to be an historical one. And I want to say something about that as a transition to talking about the church. Now, most people who have not been captured in their vision by a relational way of thinking find that the past is simply past, and that what is present is simply the present. Because how can the past be present? But if you think in relational terms, then the present is not much more than the present presence of the past. Okay? The present is the expression of that past. The present embodies that past. The whole past world is present now in our present experience. But of course, much of that past is trivially present. Most of the things that have happened in the past not only have been forgotten, but also have merged with many, many other things in such a way that it doesn't seem to make a great deal of difference whether John Smith in the year 1731 ate 2 eggs for breakfast or 1 egg for breakfast. So most of the past becomes trivial, but not all. Some events have a transforming effect upon history, even when they are not known. That is, the causal presence of the past is not simply a function of our remembering it. Now, this is surely true in our own personal lives. There are features of what happened to you in the past that you may have forgotten. Psychologists might tell you you've repressed them. But if you repress something that happened, that doesn't make it ineffective in the present. It makes it powerfully effective, usually negatively effective in the present. From a relational point of view, this kind of comment we can make about how our own personal pasts are effective in the present are not totally different from the way in which the historical past is present with us. So that when we say that the events which constitute the life of Jesus are present with us, we can say they are present in the whole world, even among people who do not know anything about them. There is a causal efficacy of those events, enormously important events. In spite of that, however, I would say that if after Jesus died and was resurrected within a generation, everyone who had seen Jesus died and they didn't bother to tell the story to anyone and no institution had been established and nothing went on about it, that by now those events would have very little efficacy in our world. The events that gather efficacy through time, the way in which the past builds up in its power in shaping the present, is through the representation of those events. It is because the death and resurrection of Jesus are represented every time the Eucharist is celebrated, that those particular events, far from having faded off into past unimportance, have even gained in strength and power through the centuries. So when we participate together in the Lord's Supper, I think it's not simply a psychological matter of our individual subjective states and how we feel and how we think, but I think those past occurrences, through their frequent representation, are actually informing and shaping this new event that's taking place right now. So I do want to talk about the real presence of Jesus in the life of the church as a whole, and somehow rather especially focused in the sacrament of the Lord's presence. Well, that real presence of Jesus in our history, and especially where it is represented, I say again, not only where it is represented, but especially where it is represented, is a presence that strengthens the universal work of Christ in the world, so that it is as Jesus Christ that the redemptive power of God is at work in our world.
Let's stop a minute there and let us digest that a little bit. It seems to me maybe what you're saying to me as a minister and to us as the church, that it's very important that we keep telling the story. That is one important way that all of that sense of the Christ is then very really present for us.
I do indeed believe that the most fundamental thing that the church does is to keep the memory of, well, the whole of God's redemptive activity with the Jewish community, and beyond that with the world as a whole alive. But for the church, the very focus of that and the clue to the whole of that is the story of Jesus.
And then looking at Jesus particularly, one of the reasons that you would be able to call him the Christ is the events of his life and death and resurrection being a transforming event of history that continues transforming us even today. Is that fair?
Yes, and you see, I'm arguing that it's not only by our conscious memory that this transforming work takes place. The past is working in us even apart from that, but the remembering it, recalling it, intensifying it makes all the difference as to whether this becomes trivial over a period of time or whether it's really focused and strengthened in its transforming power.
And so it's our choice through the community of faith and personal prayer or whatever to make that present even more effective.
Yes, and of course the Eucharist has been historically the focus of that, and the debates about in what way is Christ present have focused upon how is Christ present in the breaking of the bread and the taking of the cup.
And then in a sense, then, Luther is right. We are able then to be the Christ to one another.
Well, you're making a connection that I haven't made, but that's fine, yes.
And so now maybe we should go back and finish this exegesis of Jesus and the Christ and Incarnation and see where we end up at the end.
Good. Well, I've already begun to talk about the church, because the church has as its one most distinctive function the making present again of that particular past. Ideally, we would like to think that the church also, in the best possible way, was faithful to the meaning of those past events. But we cannot read the history of the church and say that has always been true. The church is an extremely sinful community, no less sinful than other human communities. But I do believe that even in the midst of its sinfulness, the church has almost always, almost everywhere, kept alive the memory of Jesus Christ. In fact, I would be inclined to say, if you have a community that doesn't remember Jesus, even if they use the term church, I wouldn't see any point in using the word church. I'd be inclined to say, they may call themselves that, but I wouldn't call them that. But I think any community that organizes itself so as to bring back, to represent, to remember those events, and takes those forms of action, most traditionally the reading of the Scripture and the sacraments. These are the most central ways, and preaching in Protestant circles especially as the third way of keeping those memories alive is the Christian church. I understand that in Red China, through many years, there was a congregation that was allowed to meet in Beijing, which was not allowed to have sermons and was not allowed to sing hymns, but it was allowed to read the Scripture. So they came together for an hour and read the Scripture. Well, I think that was the church. I think no less the church than if they had been allowed to do the other things, though when we are allowed to have the sacraments, surely the fullness of the church is better expressed in a fuller way of representing the past than simply reading the Bible together. I understand then that the church is the Christian community organized for the purpose of keeping alive the memory of our history. And that history centers in Jesus Christ. It is not exhausted by Jesus Christ. I think any time we separate out the New Testament witness to Jesus from the whole history of Israel's life with God, we distort and misunderstand the Christ event. That is, Jesus was a Jew, and you cannot understand Jesus except as a Jew of his own time and place, and you cannot understand the disciples except to understand them as Jews, shaped by that whole history. And there is much else in that whole history that is of great importance to Christians. This was another ancient struggle in the church, what to do with the Old Testament. And you may remember there was a man by the name of Marcion who wanted to get rid of the Old Testament. In fact, he wanted to get rid of half the New Testament too, and select a very limited canon, which he thought expressed simply the real truth about the way in which humanity and God were related. I'm very glad the church didn't follow that, but I'm rather sorry that we have tended to downgrade what we call the Old Testament, that is, the Jewish scriptures, as much as we have, because it's this whole history out of which we live. And indeed, it's not only the whole history that's found in the canon, it is also the whole history of the church as it has developed since then. Now, we can only live out of that history the way we live out of our own biographies. That is, not by celebrating everything that has happened in the past, not by identifying ourselves only with the good. We need to recognize that we are parts of a community. We are participants in a community that has committed terrible sins. From my point of view, one of the greatest things about the Jewish people is that they were willing to recite the history of the sins that they had committed. The Old Testament is not the kind of self-glorification that most people have employed as their histories. And that's why people feel distaste for it. They don't want to think that they are part of a tradition in which there was so much sin and evil. I think that's also why we skip most of church history. But we are parts of a community and a tradition which is full of sin and guilt. And we need to understand that's who we are. We are products of that. And that sin is still within us. One of the greatest sins of the Christian church is precisely the way we have dealt with the Jews. And we are still products of that. The way we talk in Holy Week is continuous with the way people have talked in Holy Week that have led to more pogroms in Holy Week than at any other time of the year. And we're still doing it. We can't say that, oh, that's those bad guys back then. Of course, the climax of all of the anti-Judaism that has characterized the whole history of the Christian church came, fortunately, not under Christian leadership, but under Nazi leadership. In many respects with the full support of the leading theologians of the time. So we cannot say that we as Christians are somehow pure and innocent. We need instead to be willing to take upon ourselves the burdens of being whom we are, sinners, the products of a sinful church history, which nevertheless remembers those redemptive events in the light of which we see the sin of the rest. And that we find in this center, Jesus Christ, the cross and resurrection being the very center of that center. So, the church is that community that organizes itself to keep alive those memories in celebration, but also in constant repentance. And therefore, we face the future not to repeat what we have been in the past, but to try to find in our time and circumstances what it means to be faithful to the one who throws light upon the entirety of that history. Now that means that the church is not constituted by any fixed doctrine. I think that's just terribly important. In fact, I would say the church is not constituted by any fixed essence at all. We could say remembering Jesus is the essence. If that's what we mean by an essence, I think that does define the church. But we should not try to find that way of being, that way of thinking, that way of feeling, that way of acting, which all people at all times should conform to if they are to be Christian. we can try again and again in each new moment to find what it means to remember and to be faithful to that memory, and hope that in the future also that will take place. So I believe that the church, in its faithfulness to Jesus, is a constantly changing movement, which is continuously facing new challenges for thought, new challenges for action, and which does not find any ready-made answers in the past for dealing with the problems of the future, but cannot deal responsibly with the problems of the future except as it allows itself to be richly informed by this whole past with its center and therefore its revelatory meaning found in Jesus. Now, in just a moment, I want to say something about the relationship about these claims with respect to Christology and the church to other religious traditions in the world. I've already hinted at some things about our relationship to Judaism, and we have so much to repent of in this respect that I think we have to be very, very cautious in making any kinds of claims that seem to continue a process of saying how much better we are than the Jews. As we study the history of Christianity, it doesn't look that way, and we need to be very sure of that. I do believe myself that I think Paul thought that we Gentiles would never really be able to pull it off right, but that eventually the Jews would appropriate Jesus, and let me add Paul. He wouldn't have added Paul, but I'll add Paul. And when the Jews have appropriated Jesus and Paul, and to some extent some already have, this is not completely futuristic, then we will really come to an understanding of what Jesus and Paul were all about and what human history was all about. So I think it's very important that we continue to witness to our Jewish friends about the greatness of some Jews whom they have not paid as much attention to as they should. And in that sense, I do believe in a Christian mission to Jews, but it must be a very humble mission. This is the child telling the parent that I think there are a few things you haven't yet quite understood about what's going on in the world, and not looking down at someone and saying what a terrible evil you've committed, as we have been saying all these years in relation to Jews. In relationship to those other traditions, and I'll take as an example Buddhism, it's the one that I've thought the most about. It may sound strange, but I think that everything that I have said today can be said without contradicting anything that Buddhists really want to say. And I think that's important. I don't think we should tone our message down. I don't think we should reduce our emphasis upon Jesus Christ as the incarnation of God in order to avoid offense to others. But then I think we need to listen very, very attentively as they tell us of an extremely different history they have had, of very different discoveries they have made. And we may find that they have a great deal to teach us, just as I'm convinced we have a great deal to teach them. I believe strongly in dialogue, but I don't think dialogue is an adequate term for what's needed. It sounds too much as if I tell that person what I want to tell them, and they tell me, and we listen to each other and like each other a little better after we've understood, and then we go off on our separate ways. I believe that the history of Christianity at its best has been a history of being radically transformed through new experiences and new encounters. And I'm convinced that we Christians, again, need to be radically transformed through our re-encounter with the Jews, through our re-encounter with the Buddhists, through our re-encounter with some other people also. So I would like to envision that the shalom, which the Jews hope for and which they associate with the coming of the Messiah, which we speak of as the kingdom of God for which we pray, will be one to which many of the great traditions of humanity can make their contribution, not by weakening the contributions that others make, not by reducing the confidence that we have in the truth that is given to us, but rather by mutual transformation and supplementation. And that truly the end for which we seek is one in which God will be all in all, and that will not mean that any one of the historical traditions will be all in all. Next time I want to talk about the mission of the church as concretely as possible in relationship to the present world situation. And we may say something else about the relationship of the religious traditions to each other, but that will be in a somewhat different context. Thank you.
John, I think that the ideas presented in this last segment were really quite clear and easily understandable and accessible to us. But knowing you, it is not only important for the church to tell the story and to represent the events of Jesus Christ, and then perhaps to be in some kind of not just dialogue, but an exchange of understandings with other faiths. You mentioned Buddhist and the Jewish community specifically. But as I said, knowing you, I suspect you feel that there are other things that the church ought to be doing as well. And I'm going to be eager to hear in the next time how all of this undergirds what else it is the church ought to be doing in the world. And so we hope you'll join us for those discussions. Hello, I'm Mary Ellen Kilsby, and I'm sitting here with John B. Cobb Jr., and we, along with you, are watching a series of tapes entitled Faith and a Relational Vision. This particular lecture has been entitled Spirituality and a Global Perspective. We hope that you'll find some practical implications for the theology that we've been discussing in the last 6 tapes.
We Americans are a practical people, and so before we get through any discussion of this sort, it becomes very important to say, so what? What does this all mean in relationship to the actual living of life and the relationship of human beings to the rest of the world? And finally today we want to talk quite specifically about the mission of the church. I hope that question hasn't occurred to you too intensely as we've gone along. Theology has a bad name in general, in the modern world especially. People think if it's theology, it can't have much to do with the reality of daily life or even with the reality of the life of the church. I think that's very untrue, but I also think there has been a lot of theology, especially in recent times, which tends to become a sort of professional discipline in the university and does get quite remote from the practical needs of the church and of individual people within the church. And process theology certainly had its origins in the university context, and so some of the debates it's been engaged in, some of the discussions that have been involved, do seem to many people to be rather remote. But I think that in fact the way we see reality and the way we understand God and the way we understand our neighbor all have extremely practical implications. And today I want to try to talk about them to some extent. Now, I'd like to begin by talking about what we've said about God. What practical implication is there for our understanding of ourselves and others in that way of thinking of God? Now, to make that clear, I'd like to begin with a very simple contrast. It's going to be a caricature of what Christians have ever said, and yet it does represent a tendency within some forms of Christian spirituality. We sometimes think that there is a fundamental difference in the direction of our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. So, for example, we think of the relationship to God as a perpendicular relationship, and the relationship to other people as a horizontal relationship. I'm sure you've seen such diagrams drawn. And then we talk about we need to be concerned about both of these relationships. But since by God we must mean that which is supremely important for us, then the relationship, the perpendicular relationship, must be the most important one, and everything else must somehow be subordinated to that. Well, that may mean that when we think about God, we turn our attention away from the world, away from other people, and that our piety, our spirituality, is something that is separate from and distinct from our relationship to other people. And a great deal of the literature of the church does have that kind of note involved in its spirituality. We shut our eyes to close out the world in order to relate ourselves to God. Now, practically speaking, there are very good reasons for closing our eyes when we think of God. Otherwise, we might think that God was like the physical objects that we see or something of that sort. And God, we certainly must find in another way than the way in which we find such objects in our environment. But the tendency to think that in our relationship to God, something fundamentally separate is going on from what's involved in our relationship with our neighbors is, I believe, a dangerous one. It leads to a history of spirituality in which spirit is opposed to body, in which the more time and attention we give to God, the less time and attention we give to the world. Now, process theology thinks that this is the reverse of the true situation. If, in fact, God is in the world, and the world is in God, if, in fact, everything we do to the least of these, our brothers and sisters, we are doing to God, if, in fact, the very way we constitute ourselves moment by moment is important to God, because God experiences it with us, and we are contributing to the divine life, then we cannot separate, cannot pull apart our relationship to God and to others. And I'm deeply convinced that the biblical understanding is much more like that than it is as though our relationship to God was something discrete from, separate from our relationship to others. Of course, there's a difference. God is not the same as our neighbors. But the way we serve God most fundamentally is by serving our neighbors. The first and the second commandments are not two drastically different things, but to love God and to love our neighbors are one and the same thing. If we say that we love God but do not love our neighbors, we are liars. That's a very important notion which characterizes biblical spirituality in a way it does not, at least equally, characterize the spirituality that comes from most of the other religious traditions of the world. So I think that a very practical implication of process theology with respect to how we understand what it means to be Christian is that the appropriate way of serving God is by serving the neighbor. But that does not mean that believing in God makes no difference and we should just function as humanists in general. Because if we believe that God is what is supremely important, then we must believe that the way of serving our neighbor must be the way that is appropriate from the point of view of God. It is the divine perspective that is the true perspective, and not the perspective that we as human beings ordinarily bring to the matters of life. I think we said something about that in relationship to this whole problem of we and they. Our ordinary human perceptions are in terms of what's good for us and how we can get some kind of advantage over them. We like to divide up the world into the good guys and the bad guys, or whatever the distinction is, and we read our newspapers, for example, to a large extent, in terms of whether our side is making progress over against the other side. That kind of habit of mind is very deeply ingrained in human nature. But if we are Christians, and if we understand that it is God's perspective and not our perspective that's the true perspective, then we need to read the newspaper in quite a different way. If we read about something that's going on in Nicaragua, the question is not whether that is good for us North Americans. The question is, first of all, is that something that is good for the people of Nicaragua? And yet it can't only be the question of whether it's good for the people of Nicaragua. It has to also be the question whether it's good for the people of the whole world, since we're all interrelated with each other in such a way that we cannot separate one people from the rest of the people of the world and be concerned only about them. And when we ask the question, is this good for the whole world, of course, very complex issues arise. There's no simple way of deciding. We have to think about it. But nevertheless, we're not likely to end up thinking that whatever is viewed as good in terms of Cold War strategies of the United States is identical with what is good for all the people of the world. Not if we really and truly think from the perspective, or try to think, I should say, from the divine perspective instead of from a merely human perspective. Now, I think we need to go even beyond that, and I've mentioned this before also, that it's not only what is good for all the people of the world, it really needs to be a matter of what is good for the whole of creation. And that means we cannot be insensitive and indifferent to the other creatures on the planet. That has lots of practical implications also, which we could spend a lot of time spelling out, but don't really have time to this morning.
John, you talked about vertical and a horizontal dimension, and I couldn't help but thinking of my Sunday school days when we talked about God, and of course in those days, He. God has no hands but our hands. And so it seems to me that at least some of us grew up feeling that the work in the world was God's work in the world, even though there was maybe this other sense of the vertical dimension as well. Would you comment on that and talk about why that wasn't adequate, for example?
Well, I like that about God has no hands but our hands, and I grew up on it too. Maybe it's one reason I became the kind of theologian that I did. It seemed to make sense.
That's right.
The attempt to find something that God's doing in the world that doesn't take place in and through the creatures has led to all sorts of strange notions of supernatural acts and the wrong notion of miracle and so forth, I think. So, of course, I'd say God not only has our hands, God has the hands of all the animals, and God has, in that sense, I'd want to break it beyond the anthropomorphic or the anthropocentric view. Yes.
Your vision does undergird it so much better, it seems to me, than those of us who grew out of the 30s or 40s theology.
Well, I think we had both. God has no hands but our hands, and also the diagram that showed the perpendicular line from above, so that when we thought of God, there was a sense that this was thinking of some sort of transcendent reality in a way that separated God from the creatures whose hands God used. And it seems to me those two ideas just need to be integrated with each other, and we have a sense of transcendence that doesn't involve us in an up-down relationship.
And then how do you feel then that this would affect what the church does in the world, or is that what we're going to be hearing more about in the next segment?
Well, the particular discussion of the mission of the church will be still later on. That'll be the 8th of the tapes. But I think that most Christians already, just by being biblical, do believe that the most direct way of serving God is doing something for the neighbor.
Yes.
But there's been a long, long tradition in Christian history and in Christian spirituality that in addition to serving the neighbor, one needs to have another dimension in one's life that is somehow separated from the neighbor. And then when people start emphasizing new spiritual disciplines and becoming more spiritual, the danger is they'll think this other dimension that cuts away from the neighbor is the one that needs to be concentrated on in being more spiritual. So I'm a little nervous about some of the great emphasis today on spirituality as reviving something in the church's history that's not biblical.
I understand. You would not say, however, though, that would be unimportant if it undergirds what you then turn around and do for your neighbor. Is that fair?
Sure. By its fruits it will be judged. But I think that it's better, even as we think of deepening our relationship to God, not to get an imagery going, that is God up there and out there, but rather to be really coming to touch with the God who is present in the neighbor and present in oneself, and in the really being and in the whole world, and really being aware of that.
Let's go on then with the end of the lecture and see how that develops.
Now, there's a whole other direction which we've emphasized, that is the relational aspect, the way in which we are all bound up with one another. And that also has profound implications practically. And I want to spend just a little time trying to explicate one area that I'm extremely concerned about, one that I think is of concern to God, who views the whole world in its interrelated unity and experiences all that is happening. And that is the area of, let's say, global economic development. Surely that's a very practical issue today. Now, the way in which our economic theory has developed, and I mean the economic theory that has been most influential in determining the patterns adopted by the United Nations and the World Bank and the United States and most of the third world governments, the way that economic theory has developed has reflected the power of atomistic thinking. And I want to illustrate that very briefly and show the kinds of consequences that have followed from that and continue today to follow from that, and then suggest that if we really looked at the world in its integration, in the interconnectedness, and saw that the location of value is in human experience and that human experience cannot be atomistically viewed at all, we would have to develop a very different attitude toward what's needed in terms of global development policies. Okay, first, a very brief sketch of fundamental assumptions that underlie present dominant policies in economics. If we have anybody here who's a specialist in the area, I'm sure they'll tell you that nobody quite believes this, and yet there is some truth to the kind of sketch that I'm going to offer. First of all, we have tended to measure progress by gross national product. And that's a view of how many goods are produced and then passed through the marketplace. And we assume that the more gross national product there is in relationship to the number of individual people who live in a country, the better off that country is, at least economically. And most of the development programs are aimed primarily at economic development. So per capita income is the gross national product divided by the population. And usually the test of whether a program is a successful program is whether it increases the per capita income in a particular country. All right, now how do you increase per capita income, or how do you increase gross national product? The basic way is by industrialization, because by industrialization you are able to increase the productivity of the individuals who make up the nation. And when you increase their productivity, you have more goods passing through the marketplace, and therefore you have more goods available for consumption. So the increase in production and consumption is basically understood to be best advanced by the introduction of technology, and that means industrial development. That means that the focus of attention for development is the urban scene. But in order to gain the resources that are needed in order to develop the cities and develop the industry within the cities, one has to build upon what is already available, and that's usually the rural area. So, but unfortunately, most of the people in the rural area are just engaged in subsistence activities. Now, subsistence activities don't show up in the gross national product at all. So you may have a village where people are feeding themselves reasonably well and are living in reasonably comfortable housing and have reasonably good clothing. We don't want to overdo it. Very few of them are living in luxury. But nevertheless, that might all be taking place, and yet their per capita income might be zero, because they only have per capita income if these goods pass through the marketplace. And if they don't have a market, then it doesn't add anything. So it looks terrible for the statistics. So how are we going to improve our statistics? Well, we've got to get these people to stop living in a subsistence way and begin producing goods for the marketplace. Now that means we disrupt the ordinary community life, and we bring in people who know what kinds of products could be exported, because we'd like to produce something that will bring in the capital from other countries that will enable us to build industry. And we also want to get some laborers in the cities so that they can do the work for us in these new factories. So we want to develop these huge new agricultural plantations for export crops in such a way they won't take as many workers as the old subsistence farming. So we introduce some technology also into the agricultural area, not to enable the people to produce better food for themselves, but in order that we can get some capital through exporting these goods. Then it's possible, in fact not only possible but necessary, for many of the people who've been living in the villages to move to the cities because there's no longer anything for them to do, and they're no longer able to produce their own food in their villages. And so now we have our workers for the factories, and we get our money for the factories, and we build our factories. Of course, we pay very low wages because we have to undersell what is done in other countries. Okay, something like that seems to be a rather typical pattern of third world development. Now, I hope you see that it is treating individual human beings as individuals and goods as substances which are traded through marketplaces and then consumed. There is very little sensitivity to the actual enjoyment of life on the part of the people involved. It seems to me quite possible that people who are producing their own food and are able to live a reasonably decent life in a traditional community and to enjoy their human relationships with their families and with the other people in the village, to know who they are, to be more or less in control of their own lives, might be better off than someone who is forced to leave the family and go work in a factory in the city, perhaps later being able to bring the family also to the city and help to produce goods and even to consume more goods produced in the market than was possible when he was in or she was in the village. But those are not the considerations which govern development policy. Now, if instead we think of the real values of life, not in terms of goods which can be owned, created and possessed, passed through markets and so forth, but the actual quality of life of human beings, then a different set of interests and concerns are going to dominate. We're really going to care about what happens to the individual human beings in the process of development. And we're going to see that relationships among human beings have more to do with the quality of life of human beings than does the exact amount of goods which they consume. And specifically, we're also going to see it doesn't make that much difference whether the goods they consume have passed through a marketplace or have come right out of the garden. That's not necessarily a great gain. It does look good on the statistics, though, and we have to keep that in mind when we think in this atomistic way. Now, I'm suggesting then that a relational vision will lead us to look at very different factors of the situation in which we are interested in seeing some development take place. And of course, there are many, many sensitive people who have already been doing this kind of thing, although there are very few governments which have adopted this kind of a policy as their dominant one. We have Gandhi on our mind these days because so many of us have seen that film, and obviously the kind of development I'm speaking of is the kind of development that Gandhi was concerned about, where you take the people where they are and try to determine what they see their needs to be, the kinds of things that would help them to have a happier life there in the villages where they are already living. And you introduce some new ideas into the community which will help them to do better the kinds of things they're already doing. And you may introduce some very simple technology. Cottage industries was something that Gandhi, for example, was extremely interested in. But you will not be concerned about the fact that the overall figures won't be greatly improved by this. It's the actual relational quality of life that is important. Now, I want to add at this point and stress a little more than I did before that from the point of view of this relational vision, the relations that count are not only with other human beings. The relations that count are relations with the whole environment in which people are living. The relations to the plants, the relations to the animals, the relation to the soil. And that the question of what a development program does to the soil, what the development program does to the forests in the neighborhood, these are questions that are extremely important when we are asking about the overall impact upon a society. If you want to speed up the improvement of the per capita income, you very often cut down the forests. And I'm sure most of you know that most of the forests of the world, that is the tropical forests of the world, will be gone by the year 2000 because they're selling these to outside interests is a major source of capital throughout Southeast Asia and The Brazilians, of course, are equally interested in cutting down their huge forests. If we ask the question of what happens to the people in the Philippines, or what happens to the people, the Igbo people, for example, in Indonesia, or what happens to the Indians in the jungles of the Amazon, we certainly will not be in a hurry to destroy the forests which have been the basis of their livelihood for all of these centuries. And also, we know that the destruction of these forests will have an effect even upon the air that we breathe and upon the whole quality of life on the planet. So that the sensitivity to the whole living system, and indeed its inorganic base, and then trying to find a form of development that arises out of that sensitivity, the whole community, which includes not only the people who are living there, but the whole living community and inorganic base of that community, is indicated as what we need from the side of this kind of a vision. And there are very practical implications of that, and of course they have to be adapted to the specific situation in each of the places where a development program is going on. One cannot move from a given vision of reality to a specific statement that this is what is needed in the Amazon, or this is what is needed in Indonesia, or this is what is needed in the Congo. But one perceives the situation differently. And it is this matter of altering our perceptions, altering our sense of what constitutes value, that seems to me to be so important today if we are to prevent ourselves from continuing a program which is fundamentally unsustainable at best and destructive of so much of human value in the meantime.
When you said you were going to be practical about this and give us some practical implications, you weren't just kidding, were you? I think that all of us would agree that there's nothing more practical than economics. And although it may take us a while to think about what you've said, to digest it, I really don't think that there's any of the ideas you've just presented were not clear or not understandable. Is there anything you think you need to comment on further before we conclude and go on?
Well, perhaps I'd just say that to be practical involves building a whole new economic theory. And theory is extremely practical.
Yes.
Because theory so shapes the way we act. And our theory expresses a basic way of thinking about things. And in this sense, I would even like for theology to be the queen of the sciences again, if it can help to provide a better ground for the theories which govern our behavior.
Yes, when I said practical, I didn't mean that that what you said was obvious. But I do think it seems to me that it's very practical implications, and that maybe what the relational vision does is to say to us what we've been doing in economics has been very unfortunate, and that we would all be better off, especially those who have so much less than we do, if indeed we took seriously the relational vision and went about in a different way, helping those people to support themselves in a way that took into account the global perspective.
And of course, it's equally important that we work out our own economic problems in a way that takes account of the global perspective. I'm afraid that as the economic crunch comes on us, we tend to become less and less concerned about the consequences of our behavior for the rest of the world, and more concerned about how we can stay in number one position.
And get further away then from the implications of the relational vision.
Yes, and also use up the resources that our children should have a chance to use.
And I think that that is a wonderful note to end on, because I think a number of people are very concerned about that particular issue. And then to backtrack and look how that relates to the relational vision, and indeed then to how we can be better stewards of God's world. Well, the next time we'll get into other practical implications and the mission of the church. Hello, this is Mary Ellen Kilsby, and I'm here with John B. Cobb Jr., and we, along with you, are watching a series of tapes entitled Faith and the Relational Vision. This is the last of the series, 8, and we're going to be talking about the mission of the church. It might be helpful to remind you that this was really the last half of the last lecture when John first did these for his own church's Sunday school class. And it may help to refresh your memory that the last time John was talking about spirituality and the global perspective. And this time we're going to be talking about the mission of the church more specifically. And so we'll watch that now.
Now, the title of today's session includes the question of the mission of the church. Well, what should the church be doing? And by beginning, by speaking of this wider context within which the church is set, I'm certainly biasing the discussion, and the natural conclusion is to say, well, if these are the problems of the world, then of course the church should be about the business of solving those problems. I'm afraid that that kind of activism doesn't work very well. I don't mean that we shouldn't be about the business of solving those problems, but unless we can be much more reflective about what particular contribution we as individuals or we as a church have to make to the whole situation of dealing with the events on this planet in relationship to God, our actions are likely to do as much harm as good. We have contributed to many of the evils of the world by our development programs also, because we haven't thought enough about what it is that really would be of greatest help. Now, last time we talked about the church, and in talking about the church, I said the very heart of the church, what constitutes the church most fundamentally as the church, is keeping alive the memory of Israel's life with God, as that centers in Jesus Christ. Now, I believe that the most fundamental mission of the church is to keep that memory alive. And that if in our haste to concern ourselves with the suffering humanity that is all around us and the horrors that are likely to await us in the future if we do not change some of our ways, we turned our back upon this most fundamental task, then we would indeed once again have, in our zeal to do good, done something terribly dangerous. There was a rhetoric around for a while, perhaps especially in the 60s, that suggested that the church should be willing to give up its very life for the sake of the world. Now that's a powerful rhetoric. Since Jesus gave up Jesus' life for the sake of the world, should we not also be ready to give up the life of the church for the sake of the world? But I do not believe it makes much sense. Perhaps in some very ultimate sense, yes, we should be willing to give up the life even of the church for the sake of the world. But we will not be serving the world by giving up the life of the church. If we do not keep alive the memory of Jesus Christ, who will do so? And if the memory of Jesus Christ is not kept alive in the world, then we will not even have that grounds, that history, that whole story to open ourselves to the needs of the world, rightly seen and rightly understood. So that the first requirement of the church is that word and sacrament be properly administered. And that's a very conservative and traditional view. And we are often terribly frustrated because it seems we spend such an enormous amount of time and energy just making the wheels spin in the church and nothing outside it happens. And I do think we sometimes spend too much and become too preoccupied with ourselves and all of those things. I certainly agree with many of those criticisms and feel them myself at times. But fundamentally, the fact that we as Christians devote a great deal of our time and energy to keep the church alive and healthy is not a failure to be dealing with the real problems of the real world in our time. There are times and places when simply keeping the memory alive and doing nothing else is already a heroic action. I spoke last time of the fact that the memory of Jesus Christ was kept alive in China through all the years when the government certainly was not encouraging that. And those people, whatever they had to do to make it happen, from our point of view, perhaps too many compromises with the communist government, whatever we may say, they performed a work of enormous importance. So, surprisingly, when finally the government opened itself to allowing once again Christian worship to take place, churches began sprouting up all over China, and people came from nowhere in order, once again, to enlarge the influence of that memory. Tremendous story, which we can certainly rejoice in. And to have asked more of those people during those years would be absurd. But that doesn't mean that we, in the most powerful and the wealthiest nation in the United States, a nation in which Protestant influence, the Christian influence generally, is still very pervasive. There's a lot of social support going our way. It doesn't mean that it's enough for us simply to be sure that the word is preached on Sunday morning and that the sacraments are properly administered and that the memory is thus kept alive. We have a larger responsibility. And that larger responsibility is also to make sure that the word is heard by more people. And that larger responsibility includes persuading the next generation, generation after generation, that this is a history and a project worth continuing. And we have to spend a lot of our time and energy doing that also. But beyond that, we are surely called to be as individuals and to be as a church in appropriate relationship to the needs of the world as these are perceived because of that story. And I've been trying to suggest at least how they appear to me because of that story. And in that case, there are many things we should be doing. But the second thing I want to say is that although certainly when we have the opportunity to provide a ministry to individual human beings who are suffering, to feed the hungry, to visit those who are sick and in prison, and so forth, and fail to do so, there's a very obvious and immediate distortion of our responsiveness to the word that we have heard. But in spite of all that, I want to say that we have tended to substitute immediate activity, appropriate activity in that case, for the harder work of thinking through what it is that we are called to do and to be in our time. And because we don't hear this message as often, I'm going to make a strong pitch this morning that a fundamental mission of the church is to think. Now, we have sort of assumed that that job is taken over by the university. But the university has divided itself up into all of these compartments, none of which reflect on its fundamental assumptions. And the fundamental assumptions that govern most of what happens in the university are, from my point of view as a Christian, wrong. And therefore, what comes out at the other end is not going to be appropriate from the Christian point of view. I'd like to contrast very briefly what the greatest intellects and the greatest scholars of our time are doing and saying on many of these most important questions of our time with the struggle of the church to do a little bit of thinking and what comes out of that struggle. And in spite of the fact that the books that come out of, shall we say, the secular world, as a convenient way, are more impressive, I believe that what comes out of the World Council of Churches, for example, is a better guide to the actual programs that we need for the future of the world than what comes to us in general from the specialists, because that's what they are. And there are reasons for that. The church cannot accept any specialization as an adequate way of thinking. The church has to think of things holistically, inclusively, and from a global point of view. And when we think from a global point of view, we must have a bias for the poor. One reason we must have a bias for the poor is that that's what most of the people on the planet are. Another reason we must have a bias for the poor is their thinking is not as distorted by their defensive concern to maintain existing structures as our thinking, when we've got so much invested in not changing things very much. And the church, when it tries to think at a global level, and I've tried to emphasize the importance of thinking from the whole back toward ourselves, not thinking from the interests of this particular segment out toward the rest. So when we try to think, as the World Council of Churches does, from a global level, we try to hear the poor. We try to hear the oppressed. And because they're there in some kind of representation, the tone of what comes out of those meetings is very different from the tone of what comes out of university conferences held in the United States. As I say, it's not nearly as scholarly, doesn't have nearly as much research behind it, but the basic gestalt, the sense of direction and movement which is implied in it, I believe is more appropriate, more really relevant to the needs of the whole world.
John, one of the concepts I liked best about this last segment that I'd like to pick up on a little bit is that the church ought to think. And when I first heard this, I thought, gee, maybe that wasn't a new idea, but it certainly is one that's gotten swept under the carpet a lot. And it is true, perhaps, that we've rushed out with Band-Aids and tried to do what we felt was right, but really never took the time to think through a problem, to think through in a relational kind of way how one corrective would then affect everything else in its wake. It's sort of like dropping a rock and seeing all these waves, and we haven't accounted for the waves. We've just tried to think about what rock we should grab. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that aspect of the church.
Well, there are several reasons we've gotten ourselves into this bind. I think one of them is that we've accepted the general notion that the departmental divisions of the university are the right way in which to think. And in that case, then the church is only supposed to think about a very narrow range of things. And then theology becomes something separated from all the other disciplines and all the rest of life, and actually rather boring.
Well, but don't we hear that from people in the pews, whether our own churches or our neighboring churches, and that is, you ought to be preaching the Bible or Jesus Christ, but stay out of politics, stay out of economics, stay out of social relationships. And maybe we've gotten afraid of really doing what we're called to do, at least in your sense, and that is thinking about how that event and the biblical faith affects all of life.
I wish people realized what a modern heresy it is that they're propounding when they tell us to do that. If you go back to the scriptures themselves, they don't stay out of anything. And if you go to the early church and read the church fathers, they don't stay out of anything. And throughout the Middle Ages, the church didn't stay out of anything. And the reformers were dealing with the whole area of political life and economic life and everything else. It's really only been since the 18th century, and as a result of the Enlightenment and the rise of a certain kind of humanism that some of these same people will be very critical of, that the church got siphoned off into one little narrow channel and was told to mind its own business, and as long as it didn't bother any of the important issues of the world, it would be allowed to do its thing. But that's a totally unbiblical way of thinking.
And with your vision, it becomes totally impossible.
It just falls to reality.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. So the next segment then will look in a more specific way of what the church ought to be doing in the world, or at least one way that we could be thinking about economics, I think, maybe, in a way that takes account of the relational vision and is one practical way we can really deal with some of the needs of our society today.
Yes, and I do want to accentuate the positive by saying that at least at the level of the World Council of Churches, there has been a recognition that hard thinking was necessary. So you can get along without hard thinking as long as you stay with people who are in the same class you are, in the same race you are, in the same segment of society that you are, and you all sort of are habituated to think in a certain kind of way, and you just assume that's common sense or Christian or something. But when you get together with people from totally different backgrounds,
and
who are just as deeply concerned to be Christian as you, all of a sudden you have to reflect about all of those assumptions. So that the very effort to be ecumenical is forcing the church to think. And one of the things I deeply regret is that the American churches pay so little attention to the thinking that goes on. I suspect more Christians in this country find out about what's going on at the World Council of Churches from Time magazine than they do from any of the church organs or by reading any of the things that came out of the World Council of Churches directly. And of course, Time is only interested in highlighting what comes out with respect to a particular political issue that American politicians are in, something like that.
That's what is sensational.
So all the thinking that goes behind that is just neglected.
Maybe we should take some of this to heart, get some of the World Council publications, and deal with those in our own church's study groups.
It seems to me that in local churches and in regional areas, as well as at the national church, that the opinion of world Christianity, insofar as it's being expressed, should be a major concern.
Let's go on then and deal with what this might be that you're talking about.
Okay. Well, let me just give one example. It was through pain and struggle that the church, and this time I'm speaking of the World Council of Churches, came to a very simple slogan. It said, what we want is a just, participatory, and sustainable society. Now, you might think anybody could have thought that up. It shouldn't take years of anguished work on the part of thousands of people, but in fact, it did take that. And it does take that because if you mean those things seriously as guides to action, they have to express sensitivity to a wide variety of concerns. The concerns for justice and participation come out and legitimately and properly come out of the needs of the poor and oppressed people of the whole world. But when others said, we've got a concern that even goes beyond that, we've got a concern for the wider planet within which human beings live, many of those who were concerned about justice and participation were very upset and struggled against saying anything about ecology or about the environment because they were afraid that would distract attention from the needs of the poor and the oppressed. It took a long time before a consensus could be reached. And I think that consensus has finally expressed the sense of interrelatedness that I'm trying to communicate in all of this discussion. Instead of saying, what you do for people will, of course, inevitably distract attention from what you do for the physical environment, and therefore we mustn't try to do both and, or what you do for the environment will distract attention from what you do for people. We need to see that the relationships between people and their living and inorganic environment are so intimate that it works exactly the opposite way. That when you are really sensitive to what's happening to the biota, when you're sensitive to what's happening to the trees, you're sensitive to what's happening to the soil, you will be much more sensitive to what's happening to the people whose lives are most intimately and closely related to those dimensions of reality. Once again, the distinction, as I see it, one important distinction between an atomistic way of thinking of things and a relational way of thinking of things is that in the atomistic way of thinking of things, you end up saying, if you do more for this segment of reality, you will do less for this segment of reality. It's known as a trade-off. And in economic theory today, a great deal is said about trade-offs. You have to decide to do this and at the same time recognize, while it's good, it's going to have bad results over here. Now, as long as you think in an atomistic way, you will inevitably use the model of trade-offs as a primary model. If you do things to improve the employment situation, then, of course, you will end up increasing inflation. Or if you do things to work against inflation, you will do something that will lead to greater unemployment, or whatever the particular pair of things is. So we are told it's all a matter of trade-off. If we understand things relationally, I believe we can refuse the model of trade-off and look for a more synergistic model. Let me just give one or two examples of that. The area of energy is one that has preoccupied our attention for some time. Now, we are generally told that if we want to avoid both inflation and unemployment, then we are going to have use a great deal more energy. And the great deal more energy will be atomic energy, since we will be running out of other forms of energy in due course. Now, That is a kind of trade-off model, because everybody knows that the building of nuclear plants increases the danger for our descendants and even for ourselves in various ways. So we are risking the future for the sake of overcoming particular problems at the present. Now, if instead of thinking in terms of that trade-off way, we say, well, now what kind of organization of our economic life could at the same time make more jobs for people, be less inflationary, and also use less energy instead of more energy, and less harmful forms of energy instead of more harmful forms of energy? Answers are quite possible. The Lovins have, for example, told us about soft energy paths and shown that when we use local energy sources instead of great centralized energy sources, and we use solar systems instead of atomic systems, far more people will be employed, local areas will have more control over their own life, inflationary factors will be less, and the damage to the environment will be greatly decreased. There are ways of stepping back from these trade-off views and seeing how, if we think relationally about the interconnection of all of these things, we can advance on all fronts. There's one other point about energy I would like to make, because it again illustrates for me the importance of a relational vision. Ordinarily, when we talk about the energy crisis, we've been talking about running out of fossil fuels and the question of atomic energy and so forth. But those who are most sensitive to the poor of the world, and that's the majority of the people of the world, and most sensitive to the real needs of this mass of human beings, tell us the great energy crisis in the world today is the crisis of firewood. There are masses of people, far, far more than those who have reason to worry about not having enough gasoline for their cars, who are having problem finding enough wood to cook their food. There are sections of the world where people are now eating their food raw, because the wood in the area in which they live has all been destroyed, and the distances to the nearest forests have become so great. If we look relationally at the real lives of human beings and ask what is their need, and how can we use even a fraction of the resources we are now using to develop huge atomic programs which take the power away from the people, how can we empower them to have decent lives? By planting trees. That kind of activity is the sort that a relational vision, I think, will lead us to. Well, I want to close by thanking you for your attentiveness and your participation in these sessions. I hope that something of the meaning of a relational vision, both for how we think of God and ourselves in Christ and the church, has come through, and I hope one sees also that there are some handles that the church can have to make its own distinctive contribution to providing a significant sense of direction, which in the long run, some of the nations of the world or the great international bodies of the world may be able to implement on a scale that clearly the church does not have the resources to do. Thank you.
And we thank you, John, for bringing to us this very valuable series, a way of focusing on philosophy, that is how we look at ourselves and God and the world, how we look at the image of Christ and our biblical faith, and focusing all that on the mission of the church, and really bringing us along with some of the foremost thinking in our churches today, and helping us to be a part of that dialogue. We're grateful to you for including us in this way.
Well, thank you, Mary Ellen, and you've certainly added a lot. We appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, and we hope you've enjoyed it too.